Hello, everyone. Today, we're venturing into the world of a lesser, known, yet profoundly unsettling criminal case, that of Pavel Shuvalov, often overshadowed by more infamous Russian killers. Shuvalov was an individual who operated under the radar for years, weaving a tapestry of deceit, manipulation, and ultimately violence. The setting of this narrative spans the transition from late Soviet society into the turbulent 1990s, a time marked by economic uncertainty, rapidly shifting social structures, and emerging law enforcement challenges. In what follows, we'll examine how Shuvalov's formative years, shaped by family discord and societal upheaval, may have sown the seeds of his criminality. Then, we'll trace his murderous path, witness the harrowing pursuit by a handful of dedicated investigators, and delve deep into the psyche that fueled his actions. While this story is undeniably dark, it also offers insights into resilience, the complexities of justice, and the human capacity to persevere through fear. Stay with us, and by the end of this exploration, you'll gain a nuanced understanding of how one individual's hidden malevolence can impact an entire community, and how that community, through unity and determination, can bring him down. Part 2 True. The path to crime from troubled roots to first blood. The socioeconomic canvas of Shuvalov's childhood. To grasp Pavel Shuvalov's trajectory, we must start by dissecting the landscape in which he was raised. Born in 1969 to working-class parents in a modest Russian town near the Volga River, he came into a world still governed by Soviet principles. Like many families of the era, the Shuvalovs lived in a cramped apartment within a drab, concrete building that housed multiple generations. Communal living was common. Privacy was scarce, and the notion of personal space nearly non-existent. Despite these harsh conditions, many families survived on collective resilience. Children found solace in neighborhood camaraderie, forging friendships across communal courtyards and playgrounds. Yet, as relatives and neighbors would later attest, Pavel was notably aloof and seldom joined these friendly gatherings. At home, tension simmered. His father, employed as a factory mechanic, worked long hours to meet strict production quotas, while his mother juggled a menial service job and domestic chores. Like countless Soviet parents, they struggled to secure basic necessities. Queues for bread and sugar were routine, and consumer goods were limited. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet system was stagnating under an aging leadership, and cracks were beginning to show. Corruption and inefficiency reverberated across institutions. In schools, educators faced large class sizes, minimal resources, and ideological pressures to conform. While many children adapted or thrived regardless, a select few, like Pavel, found themselves increasingly alienated. Suspended between the expectations of a conformist state and the creeping sense of personal dissatisfaction, he began to exhibit early signs of rebellion. Though these were mostly kept under wraps, family conflicts and emotional neglect behind the facade of every Soviet-era apartment door, unique dramas played out. In the Shuvalov household, conflict brewed constantly. Pavel's father was known for his mercurial temper, exacerbated by the stress of labor quotas and the occasional drinking binge. Frustrations often spilled into verbal tirades. Though he rarely resorted to physical harm, the emotional toll on a young Pavel was profound. Meanwhile, Pavel's mother struggled to keep the household afloat, focusing on chores and discipline while showing little overt affection. Neighbors recalled muffled arguments and the stifled weeping of Pavel's mother. While no direct evidence of severe abuse emerged, such an environment can cultivate emotional numbness in a child. Teachers sometimes noted that Pavel had difficulty relating to peers, avoided eye contact, and displayed bouts of sullen silence in group activities. Few recognized these behaviors as potential red flags. And in the Soviet system, where personal troubles were often brushed aside for the greater good, there was little incentive to intervene. From these seeds, a pattern of detachment and resentment grew. Some who later studied Pavel's life speculated that, in the absence of emotional support, he retreated into a private world of fantasies or internal monologues. This psychological isolation might have paved the way for the darker impulses that would surface in his adolescence. Adolescent rebellion and encounters with petty crime. As the 1980s arrived, the Soviet Union attempted reforms under leaders like Yuri Andropov and Mikhail Gorbachev, introducing policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost openness. Across the nation, previously unspoken social problems started surfacing in newspaper articles and televised discussions. This environment of cautious liberalization had mixed effects on youths like Pavel. While some were inspired by the chance to question old norms, others saw an opportunity to push boundaries with minimal consequence. By his early teens, Pavel Shuvalov had earned a reputation for truancy. He skipped classes, occasionally shoplifted from local kiosks, and associated with a small band of older boys who likewise felt marginalized. These petty offenses seldom triggered serious police attention, especially given the era's overshadowing preoccupations, rampant corruption, economic malaise, and ideological tensions. Teachers scolded him or placed him in remedial programs, but none suspected that these minor infractions foreshadowed something far graver. Yet the seeds of violence were already sprouting. A classmate recounted an incident wherein Pavel brutally beat another student over a trivial dispute. Despite the severity, the school tried to handle it internally, not wanting to escalate matters to the authorities. Some classmates described Pavel's eyes as lifeless or intensely cold during conflicts, as though he flicked a switch into a darker persona. Later psychological evaluations would highlight these early episodes as critical turning points, moments when he discovered the thrill of domination and realized that, if done carefully, brute force could go unpunished. Military service in the crumbling Soviet Union. At 18, like many Russian men of his generation, Pavel faced mandatory conscription. He spent 2 years in a Soviet army unit stationed near the Ural Mountains. Military service was notoriously harsh, especially in the waning days of the USSR. Brutal hazing rituals, known as dedushchena, were common, and conscripts often endured oppressive hierarchy and physical abuse from senior soldiers. Records of Pavel's specific military conduct are scarce. However, anecdotal accounts from fellow servicemen suggest that he adapted to the authoritarian environment with a grim sort of efficiency. Unlike some recruits who broke under the relentless discipline, Pavel seemed to thrive. He followed orders without complaint, rarely showed fear, and swiftly learned to shield his emotions. By his second year, rumors circulated that he had developed a unique knack for intimidation. Some said he tormented new recruits or performed tasks with a chilling level of detachment. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union itself was unraveling at the seams. By the time Pavel was discharged in 1989, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and calls for greater autonomy in satellite states were roaring. Returning to civilian life, he found a society in flux. Ideological narratives were being dismantled, shops were emptier than ever, and public faith in government was withering. For someone like Pavel, nothing. Harboring suppressed anger and an appetite for power, this chaotic environment presented both opportunities and a sense of disillusionment that further fueled his latent darkness. Early adult life drifting through turbulence. Emerging from military service, Pavel Shuvalov settled in a modest city apartment arranged through distant relatives. Lacking formal job skills beyond basic mechanical knowledge gleaned from the army, he drifted between part-time labor roles. Occasionally, nothing. He found work as a security guard for local businesses that were themselves teetering on the brink of financial collapse. Such jobs granted him authority. however minimal, and a uniform that could command a semblance of respect or fear. The Soviet Union's final collapse in 1991 plunged the country into a wild period of radical change. Organized crime burgeoned, seizing control of industries and neighborhoods. Street gangs roamed, and corruption skyrocketed among officialdom. Ordinary citizens grappled with hyperinflation, long job queues, and a faltering social safety net. In such a climate, the line between petty criminality and survival often blurred. However, Pavel's brand of deviance wasn't about economic desperation. It was about dominance, culminating in small-scale extortion or petty theft. He exploited the general lawlessness to refine his manipulative and intimidating tactics without attracting undue attention. During these years, seeds of Shuvalov's future violence continued to grow. A string of girlfriends reported controlling behavior, emotional abuse, or sudden rages. One woman described fleeing his apartment in the middle of the night, convinced that Pavel's dead-eyed stare signaled an imminent outburst of violence. Yet no formal complaints were filed, a testament to the fear he instilled and the broader distrust of police authorities. And so, behind the crumbling Soviet infrastructure, Pavel Fine tuned his capacity for cruelty. The first documented killing, a prelude to terror. It's challenging to pinpoint Pavel Shuvalov's first murder with absolute certainty, as many of his earliest presumed victims were marginalized drifters, sex workers, or individuals who had fallen through Russia's widening social cracks. However, most experts agree that around 1992 or 1993, as the country reeled from economic freefall, his brutality crossed an irreversible threshold. The earliest documented case emerged when local police discovered the body of an unidentified man in a neglected industrial zone on the outskirts of Pavel's city. The victim bore signs of a violent struggle, with injuries suggesting overkill, excessive force that went well beyond what was necessary to cause death. This was not a mere robbery gone awry. It appeared to be personal, even sadistic. Investigators initially assumed some local gang feud was to blame. They scoured the area for witnesses, but no one had seen anything. Or if they had, they were too terrified to speak out. While there was no immediate forensic link to Pavel, certain subtle markers, later recognized by law enforcement, hinted at a methodical approach. For instance, the victim's pockets were turned out, but no valuables were removed, indicating that profit was not the motive. Additionally, minor items had been arranged near the scene, suggesting an eerie ritual or personal touch. Over time, law enforcement would encounter more cases sharing these hallmarks, eventually connecting them to a single predator. Escalation and the emergence of a pattern. After this initial murder, an unsettling pattern of similarly brutal killings began to surface across the region. The victims varied in age, gender, and social standing, although many were individuals living on society's fringes. Drifters, squatters, occasional drug users. The unpredictability of victim selection, coupled with the savage nature of the crimes, confounded investigators. Gang violence in the 1990s was notorious, but these murders deviated from typical gangster executions, which often displayed efficiency and a clear motive. By contrast, these victims exhibited signs of prolonged suffering, with evidence of gratuitous violence. On the rare occasions that possessions were taken from the victims, they seemed of trivial value. Some items, like a ragged coat or old wristwatch, might be found discarded nearby, reinforcing the theory that robbery was not the objective. Police suspected a sadistic killer, but lacked the technology or cohesive investigative framework to prove it. The various precincts operating in the newly decentralized Russia seldom shared case details, hampering a holistic view of the crime wave. In parallel, Shuvalov appeared outwardly calm, continuing his menial work stints, drifting from city to city, and forming fleeting relationships. The lack of any overt suspicion from those around him emboldened him. Each killing likely provided a twisted sense of power, fueling his appetite for further violence. Over time, his confidence soared, nothing spurring him to experiment with new methods and elaborate post-mortem staging. Some investigators would later liken his progression to that of a predator haunting its hunt. Attempts at a normal life, relationships, and public persona. Despite his hidden bloodlust, Pavel Shuvalov periodically tried to embody the facade of an ordinary life. He met a woman named Irina in 1994, and for a brief period, they cohabitated in a rented flat. Friends of Irina described Pavel as quiet, polite, and somewhat old-fashioned, albeit prone to unexplained disappearances. Irina herself wavered between fascination and unease, noticing how rarely Pavel spoke about his past, family, or future aspirations. This relationship lasted about 6 months before disintegrating amid rumors of Pavel's infidelity and controlling behavior. When Irina confronted him about suspicious bruises on his arms, which she suspected came from violent altercations, he offered vague excuses involving drunken street fights. Eventually, Irina moved out, leaving him alone once more. In public, few pegged Pavel as a threat. To neighbors or colleagues, he was merely an unremarkable man in his mid-20s who kept to himself. Rarely did his stoic demeanor raise alarms. Those who dug deeper occasionally sensed his underlying aggression, like a coiled spring waiting to be unleashed. But the 1990s environment, rife with financial scams, random violence, and political uncertainty, meant that borderline antisocial behavior did not stand out as it might have in a more stable era. Pushing boundaries closer to the edge by 1995, the murder toll attributed to an unknown serial predator in Pavel's region was creeping upwards. Though local authorities remained perplexed about possible connections, investigative leads were scarce, overshadowed by the day-to-day upheavals of an economy in free fall. Some in the press had begun using the phrase Volga Phantom to describe the elusive figure rumored to be behind these sensational homicides, but official confirmation was elusive. Emboldened by his apparent invulnerability, Shuvalov took greater risks. He started striking in areas with marginally higher foot traffic, perhaps gleaning excitement from the danger of being spotted. A couple of near misses occurred. On one occasion, a late-night dog walker heard a scream and rushed to investigate, unwittingly chasing Pavel away mid-assault. Nonetheless, limited lighting and the victim's disorientation prevented a clear identification. Another time, a vigilant shopkeeper remembered seeing a figure matching Pavel's description loitering around the rear alley. But again, the tip failed to produce actionable proof. Meanwhile, the broader social climate offered him cover. Homicide rates in Russia had spiked dramatically after the collapse of the USSR, fueled by organized crime and socio-economic desperation. The savage nature of the Volga Phantom killings, horrifying as they were, often got lost in the daily headlines of gang wars, political assassinations, and widespread corruption. Against this chaotic backdrop, a single serial killer targeting random victims did not immediately galvanize law enforcement. A deadly turning point, this chapter in Shuvalov's violent evolution culminated with an act so brazen that it could no longer be dismissed. In late 1995, the body of a young woman, a part-time waitress and occasional sex worker, was discovered in an abandoned building near the river. The brutality inflicted surpassed anything local investigators had witnessed. In addition to the now familiar signs of overkill, personal items of the victim were meticulously rearranged, almost like a ritual display. It was this scene that jolted the local authorities into suspecting a single perpetrator might be responsible for a series of heinous crimes. Public outcry swelled, particularly from women's advocacy groups that had recently formed in the wake of new social freedoms. Newspapers published grim headlines declaring serial killer on the loose, igniting a wave of fear throughout the region. And so, we conclude part 2 at this critical juncture. Pavel Shuvalov, shaped by a turbulent upbringing and emboldened by Russia's post-Soviet chaos, had graduated from petty delinquency to orchestrating a trail of gruesome murders. Each new crime further fed his malignant sense of power, honing his methods and fueling an insatiable appetite for violence. But in drawing ever more attention, he also set the stage for a collision with the law. The authorities, at long last, were starting to put the pieces together, initiating a pursuit that would soon become a nail-biting race between a relentless predator and an overburdened police force. Part 3, the pursuit, investigative hurdles, near misses, an ultimate confrontation, mounting fear and media intrigue. By the mid-1990s, the phrase Volga Phantom was no longer a whispered rumor in the underbelly of the city. It had entered mainstream parlance. Television broadcasts, newspapers, and radio programs echoed with updates on the unsolved murders. Fearing public unrest, local officials tried to maintain a semblance of control. They released statements assuring citizens that all necessary measures were being taken, yet offered no specifics, fueling suspicion that they had few solid leads. Crime reporters, newly liberated from Soviet-era censorship, seized on the story's sensational aspects: scant clues, grisly crime scenes, and the apparent random selection of victims. Tabloid-like coverage stoked panic among vulnerable communities: young women walking home after dark, elderly citizens traveling alone, and the homeless seeking shelter in rundown buildings. Opportunistic politicians used the fear to argue for expanded policing powers or proposed curfews. Meanwhile, genuine alarms spread among families who worried that anyone could become the killer's next target. Within this maelstrom of fear, law enforcement faced an enormous challenge. Decentralized police departments, each with its own bureaucracy, struggled to coordinate. The concept of a serial killer was not entirely new. Russia had seen high-profile cases like Andrei Chikatilo, but the institutional memory from those investigations did not seamlessly filter down to local precincts. Technological constraints further complicated matters. Forensic labs were underfunded, and DNA analysis was still rudimentary. Investigators had to rely heavily on interviews, witness sketches, and physical evidence from crime scenes that often yielded inconclusive results. Assembling a task force, fed up with the mounting death toll and public outcry. Regional authorities formed a special task force composed of detectives, forensic experts, and a handful of younger officers versed in emerging investigative techniques. The official mandate was clear: find and apprehend the Volga Phantom, presumed to be a single serial killer, before he could claim more lives. One of the lead investigators, Captain Ilya Demidov, had developed an interest in profiling techniques after reading about them in translated criminology texts. Although formal profiling was relatively new in Russian policing, Demidov believed it could be vital in narrowing down the suspect pool. He and his team pored over murder reports from the last 5 years, searching for patterns, victim demographics, a mix of homeless men, solitary women, and elderly individuals with no clear racial or ethnic bias. Locations: mostly abandoned buildings, industrial zones, or neglected lots near the Volga River. M.O. Details: overkill violence, bizarre rearrangements of personal items, often no significant theft. Gradually, a portrait emerged of a perpetrator who sought power more than money, reveling in the vulnerability of his victims. The killer's random approach made anticipating the next hit nearly impossible. Still, the task force recognized that the murderer might be someone who blended easily into everyday society, perhaps a local resident or drifter who knew the city well. The unifying hypothesis was that the Phantom acted alone, armed with weapons improvised from the environment, and left minimal forensic traces. Challenges and setbacks in the investigation. From the outset, the task force encountered daunting challenges. Fragmented records. Official data on murders and missing persons were scattered among multiple precincts. Precious time was spent collating incomplete or redundant files. Forensic limitations. Many crime scenes were compromised by curious onlookers or incompetent initial responses. Vital footprints or trace materials were inadvertently destroyed. Public mistrusts citizens. Disillusioned by corruption or hesitant to cooperate with police. Even witnesses with potential clues often declined to come forward, fearing retaliation or dismissing law enforcement as ineffectual. Amid these hurdles, the caseload for the average officer was enormous, given that murders were only one subset of rampant post-Soviet crime. Resources were stretched thin, and investigators frequently felt they were playing catch-up. Some senior officials questioned whether focusing so intensely on this phantom diverted attention from gang violence and other pressing issues. Nonetheless, Captain Demidov and his colleagues persisted, fueled by the conviction that bringing down a sadistic killer was a moral imperative. Early suspects and dead ends within weeks. The task force interviewed numerous individuals who matched broad aspects of the emerging profile. Single men living alone, individuals with a history of violent offenses, drifters who frequented abandoned properties. Several promising leads materialized. Vasily the drunk, an ex-convict rumored to roam industrial sites at night. He was repeatedly sighted near one of the murder scenes. However, upon questioning, investigators discovered that while Vasily might be an aggressive alcoholic, there was no credible evidence linking him to the killings. Two brothers with criminal records known for burglaries and petty assaults. Their MO favored stealth and quick getaways, which clashed with the unsubtle violence of the Phantom. A former soldier with PTSD, he was singled out by neighbors for strange behavior, but deeper scrutiny revealed he was too incapacitated by mental health issues to carry out methodical crimes. Each potential suspect ultimately fell through. Meanwhile, the murders resumed, albeit sporadically, as though the killer sensed the dragnet but remained unperturbed. Investigators found themselves back at square one with a rising sense of desperation. Captain Demidov's team began suspecting that the Phantom was methodical enough to shift tactics or geographical areas whenever the investigation grew too hot. Nothing. A crucial clue emerges: survivor testimony. A breakthrough arrived in the form of a survivor, an older woman named Lyudmila, who'd been assaulted one evening near an abandoned marketplace. Terrified but resourceful, she managed to fight back and escape, though she suffered stab wounds to her arm. Rushed to a local hospital, she recounted a chilling encounter: a man with a cold, distant gaze, who approached her from the shadows and attacked without warning. She recalled a few key details. He had a faint accent or speech pattern she couldn't place, possibly from another region. He wore a dark jacket and had a noticeable mark on his right hand, perhaps a burn scar or old injury. He seemed unwaveringly calm, as if what he was doing was entirely natural. Lyudmila also provided a rough physical description: a man in his mid to late 20s, medium build, short dark hair, and an unremarkable face. While these traits sounded generic, the mention of a hand scar was significant. Coupled with the stoic demeanor and calm approach, it suggested someone disciplined or at least accustomed to violence. For the task force, Lyudmila's testimony was a lifeline. They cross-referenced the detail about a scarred hand with existing records. Although many criminals had scars from bar fights or accidents, they now had a filter to narrow the search. Captain Demidov's vow to keep Lyudmila safe prompted her to cooperate further, even consenting to help a sketch artist produce a composite drawing. The result was still somewhat vague, but it circulated among precincts and patrol units under the label Phantom Suspect. A tense stakeout operation armed with the new data. The task force orchestrated stakeouts in known danger zones, places where bodies had been found or survivors reported near attacks. Undercover officers posed as vulnerable targets. A detective feigning homelessness slept under bridges. Another pretended to be a sex worker near the red light district, and a third, an older officer, dressed as a pensioner. These covert efforts aimed to lure the Phantom into revealing himself. It was a grueling, high-stakes operation. Officers spent long, cold nights in decrepit buildings or behind dumpsters, scanning empty streets for any sign of suspicious movement. The slightest noise, a cat knocking over a tin can, a distant car engine, set pulses racing. Weeks passed with little to show. Morale dipped as investigators questioned whether they were chasing a figment of rumor. But the murders had happened, the bodies were real, and fear still gripped the city. Finally, a glimmer of hope. An undercover officer spotted a figure lurking near a closed, down textile factory in the small hours. The man was peering into a window, perhaps searching for squatters or lone individuals to attack. When the officer radioed for backup, the figure seemed to notice and slipped away into the labyrinth of alleys. A subsequent search turned up no trace. Despite the frustration, the sighting convinced the team that the killer was indeed still active in the area. Incremental forensic advances. In parallel with field operations, nothing. Forensic labs were working overtime to analyze any physical evidence gleaned from murder sites. Although modern DNA testing was in its infancy in Russia, technicians managed to isolate partial genetic markers from a few scenes. They also examined footprints, fiber samples, and even paint flakes from walls where the killer might have leaned or brushed up against. Each piece of data added a small puzzle piece to the overarching investigation. One interesting discovery was the presence of a unique adhesive residue on certain victims, presumably from duct tape or packaging tape used to restrain them. Investigators reasoned that if they could locate the exact brand or source of this tape, they might trace it back to local stores. Although a long shot, such a trail could narrow down the suspect pool, especially if cross-referenced with the scarred hand detail or other leads. The challenge, of course, was that post-Soviet Russia had a flourishing black market, and goods of dubious origin were sold in street bazaars without formal records. Still, the mere act of analyzing the tape showcased the evolving mindset within the task force. No longer were they reliant solely on confessions or eyewitness accounts. They were venturing into more methodical, evidence-based investigations, narrowing down to Pavel Shuvalov eventually. A minor stroke of luck altered the course of the case. Police responded to a domestic disturbance call in a different district, where a young woman alleged her boyfriend had threatened her with a knife. Upon arrival, officers discovered the man was injured. He had a conspicuous burn scar across his right hand and displayed an unnerving composure when questioned. The woman declined to press charges, but the arresting officer, familiar with the Phantom Suspect bulletins, noticed the scar and filed a special report. That man was Pavel Shuvalov. At first glance, there was no direct evidence tying him to the murders. His criminal record included minor offenses, but nothing that warranted immediate suspicion of serial murder. However, the combination of his calm demeanor, the distinctive scar, and a series of unaccounted for absences piqued investigators' interest. They discreetly requested background checks, prior addresses, employment history, known associates. Captain Demidov's team meticulously reviewed Shuvalov's timeline, noting that his relocations corresponded suspiciously with clusters of unsolved killings. They also discovered that Shuvalov had served as a security guard at various points giving him plausible knowledge of abandoned complexes and industrial sites. A search of his partial military record hinted at involvement in harsh training exercises and a capacity for stoic endurance. Nothing. Aligning with the profile of a killer able to operate methodically over extended periods. While still circumstantial, these clues prompted the task force to place Pavel under covert surveillance. It was risky and resource-intensive. He was cunning, and one misstep could send him underground. Tailing the predator a dangerous game, over the next several weeks, plainclothes officers followed Shuvalov from a distance. He moved unpredictably, sometimes taking late night walks in deserted neighborhoods, other times slipping into internet cafes or cheap bars. Investigators noted that he frequented certain sites infamous for squatters or drifting sex workers. He rarely spoke to anyone, but he seemed always to be watching. During this surveillance phase, tensions among the task force soared. One officer nearly blew their cover when Shuvalov seemed to sense he was being followed and abruptly changed direction. Another time, nothing. An undercover operative reported losing track of him for hours in a warren of backstreets, only to find him reemerging near an abandoned train station. Captain Demidov realized that if Shuvalov acted on impulse, if he found a new victim, the team might be forced to intervene without enough evidence to guarantee a conviction. As the net tightened, investigators meticulously planned an arrest strategy that could withstand scrutiny in court. They gathered any material linking Shuvalov to known murder sites, cell phone tower data, eyewitness accounts, and potential forensic matches. Some of the partial DNA markers from crime scenes, while incomplete, showed promise of matching Shuvalov's profile if tested thoroughly. The task force simply needed a conclusive piece of evidence to trigger an official warrant. The dramatic arrest, the climax, occurred on a cold autumn evening in 1996. Undercover detectives observed Shuvalov lurking around a derelict warehouse near the Volga's shoreline. A lone figure, a homeless man, was sleeping in the corner of an adjacent lot. Shuvalov moved quietly toward the man, weapon at the ready. The task force sprang into action. Officers emerged from the darkness, guns drawn, shouting for him to drop the weapon. For a split second, it seemed Shuvalov might lash out. Instead, his face darkened. He dropped the blade and coldly surrendered. He uttered no words, only offered a thin, eerie smirk. Within minutes, police had him cuffed and secured. A search of his belongings turned up a small roll of duct tape, a hunting knife stained with what appeared to be old blood, and other items that echoed crime scene anomalies. The so-called Volga Phantom had at last been apprehended. Relief washed through the city, though the true scope of his crimes and the harrowing details would only come to light in the ensuing weeks of interrogation and forensic analysis. Thus concluded the tumultuous pursuit of Pavel Shuvalov, a predator who thrived in chaos, slipping through the cracks of a transitioning nation. The next stage would shift from the chase to unraveling the twisted mind behind the bloodshed, a process that would reveal the darkest corners of his psyche while testing the resolve of everyone involved in bringing him to justice. Part 4. Inside the Criminal Mind, Psychological and Motivational Analysis, evaluating the post-arrest persona following his arrest. Pavel Shuvalov displayed an unsettling composure that rattled even seasoned investigators. He offered monosyllabic responses to routine questions: name, date of birth, address, nothing. His demeanor was a curious blend of detachment and cold curiosity. While some suspects crumble under the weight of interrogation, Shuvalov seemed to derive a subtle pleasure from the tension in the room, as though he were assessing his questioners with the same dispassionate scrutiny he once reserved for his victims. Initially, he denied any involvement in the murders, attributing the bloodstains on his knife to self-defense scuffles, and dismissing the duct tape as a tool he carried for odd jobs. However, when confronted with mounting evidence, survivor testimonies, partial DNA matches, and the suspicious pattern of his whereabouts, he occasionally lapsed into brief admissions or cryptic hints. Investigators noted these as confession-like fragments, though Shuvalov was never fully transparent about his motives. Early psychiatric assessments. Within days of his detention, the authorities arranged for Shuvalov to undergo psychiatric evaluations to determine competency and glean insights into his psychological state. The psychiatrists found a man whose emotional range seemed severely constricted. He exhibited blunted affect, minimal display of fear, remorse, or anxiety. Egocentrism, a pervasive belief in his superiority, indicated by subtle statements of disdain for weak people or fools who get themselves killed. Possible sadistic impulses. When asked hypotheticals about violence, he responded with chilling indifference, indicating a fascination with other people's suffering. While not overtly psychotic, he did not display disordered thinking or hallucinations. He did demonstrate traits consistent with severe antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, or psychopathy. This distinction is vital in legal contexts, as psychosis can render a suspect mentally unfit for trial. In Shuvalov's case, the early consensus was that he comprehended his actions, making him responsible under law. Childhood trauma and emotional deprivation. As part of the evaluation, psychiatrists and criminologists revisited Shuvalov's formative years, digging into family, school, military service, and subsequent life events. The composite picture reinforced the idea that emotional neglect, familial tension, and an intrinsic capacity for violence all coalesced in him. There is a long-standing debate in criminology over whether nature, genetic predisposition, or nurture, environmental factors predominantly shapes a serial killer. With Pavel, both seemed to play a role. His father's hot temper and emotional distance, combined with a society in upheaval, likely heightened the darker aspects of his personality. Moreover, the violence he encountered in the military may have normalized aggression as an acceptable means of control. Nothing. The intermittent acceptance he found among petty criminals and opportunistic acquaintances could have fueled a sense that intimidation was a viable life strategy. Without stable emotional anchors or moral guidance, Shuvalov gravitated toward the ultimate expression of dominance, taking lives without compunction. Power, control, and the illusion of invincibility. Interviews with Shuvalov revealed a recurring theme of power and control. He spoke condescendingly about his victims, though never in detail that might incriminate him further, and implied they were destined to be prey due to their weak status. This rhetoric hinted at a twisted worldview wherein might makes right, and survival of the fittest is the ultimate law. The chaotic backdrop of 1990s Russia likely reinforced this belief system, as corruption and inequality flourished, and moral absolutes seemed less universally upheld. Criminal psychologists observed that Shuvalov displayed a god complex of sorts, relishing the notion that he decided who lived or died. Indeed, several offenders with similar profiles articulate a near euphoric sense of omnipotence while committing acts of violence. The overkill nature of Shuvalov's murders, using more force than necessary, underscored the sadistic gratification he gleaned from surpassing mere killing to inflict maximum terror and pain. The role of ritual and symbolism. One perplexing aspect of Shuvalov's crimes was the strange staging of victims' belongings post-mortem. Investigators discovered personal effects, placed in deliberate formations, or arranged to evoke a sense of twisted display. Shuvalov never explained this in explicit terms, but professionals speculated that it served multiple functions: psychological signature, a personal stamp of ownership, akin to saying, "I was here." and I controlled every aspect of this situation. Ritualistic satisfaction. The arrangement might have allowed him to relive the kill, extending his moment of dominance beyond the victim's death. Provocation. On some level, it might have been a challenge to law enforcement, a subtle taunt. While not all serial killers engage in ritualistic behavior, nothing. Those who do often find deep psychological significance in it. It bridges the gap between the raw act of murder and a symbolic or quasi-artistic expression of their internal fantasies. For Shuvalov, it may have been a final, triumphant flourish after an adrenaline-fueled scene of violence. The intermittent desire for recognition. Although he largely feigned indifference, nothing. There were moments when Shuvalov appeared almost proud of the chaos he had sown. Interrogators noticed a flicker of smugness when they confronted him with media reports labeling the Volga Phantom as the region's most feared killer. He seemed to revel momentarily in the notion of being the invisible puppet master who had orchestrated widespread dread. This aligns with a subset of offenders who, nothing while not always seeking direct publicity, like writing letters to newspapers, nonetheless crave a reputation, if only as a private testament to their prowess. Yet Shuvalov simultaneously recognized that outright bragging could jeopardize his legal defense. Thus, he alternated between coy silences, partial admissions, and condescending statements about how incompetent the police were for taking so long to catch him. This contradictory stance, craving recognition but avoiding self-incrimination, frustrated investigators who struggled to piece together a coherent confession. The disconnect from empathy, a hallmark of psychopathy, is the inability to empathize with victims, and Shuvalov exemplified this. When asked about the emotional or moral weight of taking a life, he shrugged or smirked, occasionally offering statements like, "Everyone dies someday." He neither apologized nor demonstrated sorrow, even in the face of photographic evidence or personal stories of the deceased. This emotional disconnection validated earlier theories that he saw others primarily as objects or potential pawns in his grand narrative of dominance. Criminal profilers also note that such detachment can be partially learned, developed through repeated acts of cruelty that gradually erode moral inhibitions. Each successful kill presumably desensitized Shuvalov further, reinforcing the notion that emotional ties or sympathy were weaknesses. This is consistent with how many serial offenders describe becoming numb to violence, their initial qualms fading as the acts recur. The influence of societal breakdown. While some aspects of Shuvalov's pathology were innately personal, the broader environment of post-Soviet collapse undeniably provided fertile ground for him to thrive. In more stable societies, early warning signs, escalating cruelty, suspicious absences, shady acquaintances might have triggered interventions or at least consistent scrutiny. But in 1990s Russia, institutions were inundated by widespread crime, and the public often avoided police out of distrust or fear. Shuvalov could move from city to city with scant official oversight, forging new identities or going by slightly altered names if he wished. This environment also contributed to his worldview that survival hinged on ruthlessness. If bureaucrats could be bribed, criminals could gain wealth by intimidation, and honest citizens were left unprotected, it was not hard for a man like Shuvalov to justify a path of predatory violence. From his perspective, the social contract was already broken. He simply exploited the chaos to his advantage. Attempts at rationalizing. Murder. During one interrogation, Shuvalov attempted a twisted rationale. He implied that many of his victims were burdens on society, the homeless, the addicted, the elderly with no families, and that he was, in a perverse sense, saving them from their miserable lives. Such justifications are common among certain killers who try to cast themselves in a quasi-benevolent role, absolving themselves of guilt by reframing homicide as a service or necessity. This line of reasoning, of course, holds no legal or moral weight. Yet it offers insight into his mental labyrinth, nothing, where extreme violence could be justified if it served a warped logic. Psychologists dub this a form of moral disengagement, an internal cupping mechanism that prevented him from confronting the raw evil of his deeds. By recasting murder as a favor, he dodged the psychic toll that genuine remorse might inflict. Reflection on the perfect storm of factors. In summation, Pavel Shuvalov's rise as a serial killer was propelled by a confluence of personal and societal factors. Troubled upbringing, emotional neglect, and familial discord planted early seeds of aggression. Institutional failure as Soviet society and later post-Soviet chaos provided no consistent oversight, allowing deviant behaviors to go unchecked. Psychopathic traits, an innate or cultivated inability to empathize, coupled with a grandiose sense of self, formed the bedrock of his violent acts. Methodical adaptation, military and security roles honed his capacity for stealth and intimidation. Cultural and economic collapse, the lawlessness of the 1990s gave him ample cover to operate largely unimpeded. No single factor alone can account for the scale or brutality of Shuvalov's crimes. Rather, it was the synergy of these elements, perfect storm, that turned him into the Volga Phantom. By the time authorities finally cornered him, countless lives had been disrupted or destroyed. Yet if there is a silver lining, it lies in the lessons gleaned about the importance of robust investigative techniques, public awareness, and psychological profiling. Armed with this knowledge, future law enforcement endeavors can better detect and thwart the next Shuvalov before bodies begin to pile up. Part 5 Tree. The end. The case of Pavel Shuvalov, the elusive Volga Phantom, stands as a testament to how violent impulses, left unchecked, can evolve into a terrifying chain of murder, rooted in a troubled childhood and emboldened by the chaos of post-Soviet Russia. Shuvalov exploited societal fragmentation and resource-strapped policing to carry out a string of brutal homicides that left communities in fear for years. Yet, it's also a story of perseverance. Dedicated investigators, armed with emerging techniques and unwavering determination, ultimately broke through the barriers to connect the dots and bring him to justice. In exploring Shuvalov's life and crimes, we see a confluence of factors, personal, familial, societal, that transformed a sullen teenager into a remorseless predator. His motivations, steeped in dominance and sadism, provide a chilling glimpse into the darker recesses of human psychology. By piecing together forensic evidence, survivor accounts, and patient detective work, law enforcement illuminated patterns that once seemed invisible in the chaos. The capture and trial of Pavel Shuvalov signaled not just an end to a horrifying series of murders, but also a turning point in how Russian authorities approached serial crime. If this narrative has compelled or unsettled you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Also, please remember to like, subscribe, nothing, and turn on notifications so you won't miss upcoming explorations into true crime stories, just as complex and haunting as this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of human darkness. Even when the world seems to unravel, resilience and the pursuit of truth remind us that, in the end, injustice can still prevail.